Hi. Slightly unusual location. I am in bed. Basically, I couldn't sleep. 5:24 a.m. sleep. Um, and I was going to make this video yesterday, but I was very tired. I went to bed and yeah, uh, realized it was quite early, but couldn't sleep anyway. So yeah, my system's all over the place. But anyway, I think making a video is as productive as anything. So I want to talk about a very interesting period of history, a very tragic period of history as well, in many ways. Um, but I kind of want to raise a lot of what ifs. Now, a few disclaimers here. I'm not an expert. I'm just someone who's very interested in history, and I'm not making any statements of fact regarding the what ifs. Just, that's all they are. Um, but as you'll know from the title, this is about the Romanovs, the last ruling dynasty of Imperial Russia. Um, Christmas time, my father showed me a docu-drama, because he's also very interested in history, on the Russian Revolution, particularly focusing on the October Revolution. And it was very well done, had actors playing Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky, and Kerensky. Um, if you don't know, basically February Revolution was a revolution that overthrew the Tsarist system, but it was led by relative moderates who proposed a sort of interim government whilst, I guess, reforms were being made. Well, that's a very, very loose way to look at it. Um, that was quite a violent revolution. There was 1,500 people killed in St. Petersburg. But the famous revolution, the one where you see the iconic images of Lenin, appealing to the masses and so on, came in October. Now, what was interesting about this documentary was they showed it was a lot less dramatic than history implies. That's not to say it wasn't important, but the actual circumstances were less dramatic. In 1927, a decade after the events, there was a Soviet propaganda film called October, and it showed the starving masses storming the Winter Palace and deposing the Tsar by force. Um, And the reality is, at the time of the February Revolution, all three men, Trotsky, Stalin, and Lenin, were not even in the country. And they were simmering with impatience for real change to happen as they saw it. But in the October Revolution, from what I can tell, it was relatively bloodless compared to the February Revolution. Um, I'm not talking about the events that followed, I'm talking about the actual events itself. From what I can tell, I could be wrong about that. But the Wikipedia article doesn't state any casualties, and it would appear that it was quite different circumstances. What actually happened was the Council of Soviets, that is different councils, so to speak, from all across Russia, um, basically walked out on Lenin and the Bolsheviks, um, and that's how they took power. So it's not black and white. It's not a straightforward case. Anyway, that context is very important to understand. If I can find the documentary again, I will make a link to it. It's very interesting stuff. But I want to focus particularly on the Romanov family. After watching that, I revisited a TV film by HBO that I'd seen some years ago, quite some years ago, and it always really moved me because of the strong performances and because of there was a particular piece of music used in that, which I just found profoundly haunting and moving. Anyway, the dramatization was called Rasputin, Dark Servant of Destiny, and it starred the late Alan Rickman in the title role, with Sir Ian McKellen as Nicholas and Greta Sacchi as the Empress Alexandra Fedorovna. I'm not sure who played the daughters, and Tsarevich Alexei. But basically, this is about Rasputin, about how he came to the royal palace. There's some artistic license in terms of the exact time frame, But Rickman was superb, absolutely superb in the role. There's points where it's quite funny actually, because he was obviously a very colourful character. There's points where it's quite shocking, but it's well worth watching, and you can find it on YouTube. I'll put a link to that. From 1996. Surya McKellen was very good as the Tsar. I've seen different portrayals of this, and I have to say it's the best one I've seen. I mean, different portrayals of what happened at Ekaterinburg. Best simply insofar as moving. Um, I've also got this book by Helen Rappaport, or Rappaport, I'm not sure if that's a silent T. Ekaterinburg. It's westernized. It's also spelled Yekaterinburg, but that is the city in the Urals. It was then a lot smaller, where the family was taken to the Patiev house, which was an old merchant's house, and they were massacred along with three servants in the basement of that house. Today, I understand it's a church dedicated by it's the Russian Orthodox Church, the Church on the Blood, and the entire family and their servants have been sainted um, as passion bearers of the Russian Orthodox Church. Um, anyway, if you see the film Rasputin, Dark Servant of Destiny, it does show the assassination scene, and it is very, very powerful because what is believed to have happened, and all the portrayals show this, is that the family was led to the basement on the pretense that they were going to get a photograph taken, from the idea that people in Moscow felt they were dead. So it was to kind of prove their captors, to prove that they were still alive. Um, and unfortunately, it was just a ruse to get them all in one place. Um, because they were in that house, I believe, for quite a while. It's quite a few months. Um, so they were all in the one room. They were given chairs, almost like they would take a family portrait. And then we'll never really know the exact account of what happened. This particular portrayal showed the leading guard. I think it might have been Yakovsky. Uh, anyway, the leading guard saying, "For crimes against Russia, you've been sentenced to death. Your lives are no more," something to that effect. And then they just gunned down. Now, in history, it's thought that some of them were bayoneted as well. And the long-standing idea of Anastasia possibly surviving, I'll just briefly touch on that because it is a big part of the legend. This comes from the idea that the girls, the duchesses, young women, their corsets may have actually prevented the bullets from getting in, almost like a almost deterrent effect. And it's possible that some of the guards were more sympathetic to the sisters in particular, and it's possible that they may have been reluctant to kill the youngest, Anastasia and Tsarevich Alexei. By the way, the Rickman film goes entirely through his eyes, which makes it all the more poignant. And then it shows the end, he's the last survivor. It's a very, very powerful portrayal, and you can't fail to be moved by it. Um, but anyway, the idea is that the sisters, their corsets prevented the bullets from fully penetrating, and so that's where the idea that some of them might have survived came from. In fact, whilst it was always Anastasia was thought to be the one that survived, some sources said it might have been Maria, four sisters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. Of course, this became a thing of legend, you know, the lost Russian princess. It was turned into a Disney film. There were many pretenders, people who, one of the most famous perhaps was Anna Anderson, who later turned out to be, I believe, a Polish factory worker. Um, but, you know, it became one of the great stories of the 20th century. Sadly, in 2007, the remains were found in 1991 and there were only nine bodies when 11 people had been killed. So in 2007, it was confirmed on DNA tests that every Romanov was accounted for. They were all killed in 1918. Um, so this brings me to some of the questions around this. It's well known that our King George V, and if you look at George V and Nicholas together, it's uncanny how similar they look. They were cousins, along with Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. Wilhelm didn't quite look like Nicholas and George. His moustache was a little bit of a different shape, but the similarity between Nicholas and George is incredible. Um, and you have a real struggle telling who's who. I think slight difference in the uniform, but that's about it. Um, they were good-looking men. They were striking. Um, and it's one of those questions about history, I think. What if George V had provided refuge to the Romanovs? Um, the obvious question here would have been getting them out of Russia, which wouldn't have been easy. The SAS, as far as I know, hadn't been created at that point. Wasn't any sort of. We had MI6, we had certain special units of the British Army, but it would have meant. I mean, we were already involved in the Russian Civil War, which had broken out by this point. In fact, 938 British troops died in the Russian Civil War, which I only found out yesterday. I knew we'd intervened, I didn't know we had casualties. Um, so that's an obvious question. If we did provide them exile, how would it have practically been done? How would we have got them that passage? Okay, so let's say it was successful. Let's say we got the Romanovs out and would provide a refuge to them in one of our palaces. They were, after all, family. Nicholas was George's cousin. Queen Victoria famously was the grandmother of Europe, so pretty much every royal family in Europe was connected to Queen Victoria on some level. Um, George V was her grandson. Nicholas II was her grand nephew, I believe. So that's very important to understand. But what's also important, I think, to understand is the context of the time. Britain wasn't seeing revolution in the way that Germany and Russia was. Germany also had its revolution, the Spartacus uprising of 1918. There was deep, deep views against the ruling systems in both countries because both countries suffered enormously in the Great War. Russia had over 2 million dead soldiers. Germany had very high losses as well. So there were mutinies at the front. Now in Britain, um, there was also rising socialist sentiment, particularly in northern cities like Liverpool and Glasgow. These were very real feelings. At one point, I believe troops were even sent into Glasgow, Red Clydeside. So the socialist sentiments were very strong, but we never quite got to the extent of revolution. I think one reason for this was that George V had been quite practical during the war. For a start, they changed the family name from Saxe-Coburg to Windsor, make it sound less Germanic. They also lived quite frugally for a royal family. They didn't want to give the idea that they were living in luxury whilst their people were suffering. There were, in fact, Zeppelin raids during the First World War. We think of the air raids of World War II, but there were also air raids in World War One. So George insisted that his family live quite frugally. Nicholas actually um, it's worth noting that the Duchesses served as nurses in the First World War, so we're not talking about a family kind of living up with lavish parties. Nicholas did believe, in fact, that they had duties and his daughters should serve as nurses. He obviously wore that military uniform. Um, so I think what happened was George V, along with David Lloyd George, um, believed that had they given refuge, that could have inspired Bolsheviks in the UK. Frankly, it was probably a bit of cowardice on the part of arcane pragmatism, but also perhaps a little bit of cowardice, if I'm being totally honest. And no disrespect to King George V, but it's hard to look at it any other way. Um, so in a sense, it feels like a betrayal to his family, and Nicholas must have felt that. But had they come here, we would almost certainly become then enemies of Bolshevik Russia. Um, might even have led to war. Who knows? Um, so, whilst it can be seen as backstabbing or betraying, there were practical reasons perhaps behind it. But it is sad. One of the big questions, of course, is why punish innocent children? I mean, Alexei and Anastasia were basically children. Anastasia was 16, Alexei was 13 for the crimes of their father. Um, but I think the idea was to wipe out any sense, any sort of chance of a restoration. Maybe the Bolsheviks were looking at what happened here with the Wars of the Three Kingdoms and the regicide of Charles I. Of course, what happened? Cromwell got strung up later on by Charles II and his allies, posthumously, of course. But maybe the Romanovs, excuse me, the Bolsheviks, didn't want to make the mistake of previous regicides. They wanted a total wipeout. But it was brutal. There's no question about it. And what happened afterwards was brutal. They apparently were thrown into an old mine shaft. I mean, this is brutal treatment of anyone. But when you consider this was once one of the most powerful royal families in the world, it's it's pretty awful. Um, I'm going to round this up soon, but let's just have a quick look at Nicholas's legacy and some of the issues around that. Let's be honest, Nicholas II was not a good ruler. He wasn't. Um, Aside from the fact that he still doggedly held on to this notion of divine right of kings in the 20th century, at a time when there was electricity and flight, he still believed in the divine right of kings. Nicholas was woefully out of touch, I think, with the Russian people. Um, I don't think he ever really appreciated the depth of anger that was felt against his system. I think had he shown a bit more empathy and a bit more understanding, might have quelled some of the anger. And I think Alexander Kerensky, i.e., the Menshevik faction, would probably have had more public support. Um, and there might even have been some sort of compromise where there could have been possibly even a constitutional monarchy. Nicholas could have been forced to make reforms. Um, you know, that could have been a possibility. But his stubbornness on that issue, I think, was definitely a factor. Rasputin, I don't think that could be overlooked. The power that Rasputin had in terms of the optics, corruption at the highest levels, of the influence he had on the royal family, I think that definitely didn't help their image. Um, Nicholas's response to the 1905 revolution was bloody. There's no question around it. I mean, that was a massacre. And whilst I think it was probably pushed by his ministers more than Nicholas himself, he failed to understand the anger um, around it. The Russian people were suffering, badly, not only the losses in the First World War, but um, other hardships they were facing. Although I should say, when people say the Russian people were starving, the very devastating famine came after the Romanovs were killed, the Great Russian Famine of 1921 to 22. That was under the Bolshevik watch, not under the Tsar's watch. The last major famine I understand had been 1891, um, which was before Nicholas was crowned. There was something called the Kadinka tragedy, which was a human stampede that happened at his coronation. Now, that wasn't a massacre, it was a tragic accident. But again, Nicholas was easily led by his advisors who advised that he attend a French state banquet and, not risk offending the French. They weighed up that it was better to offend the Russian people by appearing out of touch and not, showing any real sympathy to this tragedy rather than offend the French. I think they could. That's just one of many mistakes Nicholas made. He could have got around that by apologising to his French guest, but explaining the circumstances and attending the victims. I think that would have been understood, and it was a major tragedy. 1,400 almost people killed. The anti-Semitic pogroms were shameful and cannot be condoned. Again, Nicholas done nothing to rein in on that. His predecessor, Alexander III, had brought in anti-Semitic policies. So there were many, many things that are a big stain on Nicholas's legacy. Having said that, I also don't believe that he deserved the level of vilification that the Bolsheviks leveled against him. I mean, he was basically demonized as a monster. I I sway to the view that Nicholas was more incompetent than callous. I think that a lot of the disregard that he had for the suffering of the Russian people came about from being a weak figure. He didn't have the assertiveness to demand of his ministers to improve their lives. I think he was probably somewhat pushed around by powerful ministers. This is not an excuse. He was Tsar. He did have that divine right. Um, but it's hard not to look at the human side of what happened to the Romanovs. I mean, whatever faults Nicholas had as a ruler, he was unquestionably a devoted family man. He cared deeply for his children and his wife. His wife was very sick woman. His young son Alexei had hemophilia. He had four vulnerable, naive young duchesses, young women. So it's hard not to feel some sympathy with Nicholas in those circumstances. And to wipe out the entire family, it was a brutal, brutal act. Plus their servant. Um, I think a story like that will endure forever. I think they'll always be interested in it. Um, could history have been different had we given the Romanovs exile? I don't know. I don't know. It's possible we could then have went to war with Bolshevik Russia, but it is possible that had there been some sort of restoration, maybe with Menshevik factions working with the Romanovs, but under the terms that it was a constitutional monarchy, um, perhaps if a lot of different things had taken effect, if the Bolsheviks hadn't won the Russian Civil War, um, there would have been no Soviet Union, and it's very possible we would have much better relations with Russia today. I think it's very possible. I think there would have been still some disagreement. Um, I mean, who knows what could have happened in 100 years? We could have had disputes with the Romanov dynasty. Royal families quarrel often, but I don't think it would have been to the extent of a Cold War. We might have had some issues with human rights as that became more and more of a sort of in the 20th century. I think we probably would have pressed Romanovs on some of the things that happened on their watch. I think ultimately we would have had good relations, um, or better relations, and history could be very, very different. I don't think there's any chance of Russia returning to a royal family, although some have said that Putin sees himself as the last Tsar. It's hard to know Putin's reading on his ambitions, whether he wants a return of the Soviet Union. He infamously described the fall of the Berlin Wall as the greatest tragedy of the 20th century, or if he actually wants to see a return to the old Tsarist empire. One could believe that that is in his designs. But it's a fascinating period of history, and I think there'll always be interest In it, there are, of course, some surviving Romanovs, but they are very, very far down the line, and I don't think it will ever be restored. But I think Russia is a very complex country, and I think that there will be many in Russia who maybe now regret that regicide. But then again, this is a country where Stalin is still revered, so it's hard to know. Russia is a deeply religious country, of course, and the Romanovs are saints in the Russian Orthodox Church. Whether that has an influence on public opinion or not, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if a public poll was taken today on the Romanovs. Here's a famous picture. Royal family. You see the duchesses looking beautiful in their white dresses. Nicholas always immaculate dress. Here's a picture of George V. Tsarevich Alexei. Um, I think I think that's George and that's Nicholas with our future King Edward VIII. Um, then there's a picture of the three older sisters as nurses in the First World War. Anastasia was too young at the time. Um, But I don't believe that the Romanovs, I'll just close with this, were totally without feeling. I don't think Nicholas was an evil man. I think he was more incompetent and tyrannical. Although some of the things that happened on his watch were inexcusable, but it also needs to be looked at in the context of the time. Um, Although even with that, he was a pretty bad ruler. Um, but I think it's more a case of incompetence and not being assertive enough, rather than, I mean, far more Russians died under the Bolsheviks than under the Romanovs. That's irrefutable. And I'm talking about the Romanovs. I'm talking about 300 years of Romanovs, not just Nicholas. Um, if you look at the repressions, I think you'll find a lot more people died under communism. Um, 30 odd years of Stalin's regime rather than 300 years of Romanovs. I think you'll find a lot more people died in mass executions, Gulag system, and so on. There were repressions under the Tsars for sure, some very brutal repressions, but I think the worst atrocities came on Stalin's watch. But it has to be said that it's understandable why the revolution happened. Nicholas didn't grasp the anger that was against the injustice of that system. I think he should have been a lot more assertive, and maybe the Russian Revolution wouldn't have happened. But I think struggles that the Russian people were going through, it was inevitable. I better round this up. 26 minutes, my goodness. Thanks for watching, and let me know your thoughts.